Welcome to Common Sense Care, parenting your gender-confused child with truth and love, brought to you by Partners for Ethical Care. So-called affirmative care is the gender industry's one-size-fits-all answer for all people who struggle with their identity. But in no other area of medicine, psychology, or education is one treatment plan assigned to every person. At Partners for Ethical Care, we believe that each person is an individual and should be given the treatment plan that is most suitable for them. Today's topic, welcome back. I'm Maria Keffler.
And I'm Erin Brewer, and we have been talking about trauma, depression, autism. What are we talking about today, Maria?
Well, following up with our autism, trauma, and depression episodes, we thought we should talk today about just in general, what are some of the reasons why kids might get sucked into gender ideology? Those are three big ones, being on the autism spectrum, having prior trauma, or suffering with depression. But there's a lot of other reasons kids are getting sucked into this.
Yeah.
So,
And I think that's really important for parents to know, because they might be thinking, well, my child's not autistic. I don't think my child's experienced trauma. They didn't seem depressed before they got into this. And so I do think it's important for us to touch upon the fact that there are all sorts of other contributing factors that can lead a child to be vulnerable to this ideology.
Yeah. I know one mom, when her middle school daughter announced this, was just terrified that something had happened to her daughter. Have you been molested? Did something serious happen to you? That child has, a couple of years later now, desisted. And no, she didn't have any specific trauma, anything like that happen. It was more getting sucked in via the social media, via the friend groups, via the GSA club. The mom actually said she thinks the daughter was kind of targeted to be sucked into this cult.
Right.
So it's
that's
good.
something, yeah, I think that's something parents don't realize, the power of social media right now. I have talked to a number of detransitioners who just simply sort of fell into this ideology after being exposed to it on social media. And it's very compelling. It really draws kids in. So even if you have a kid who's not particularly vulnerable at the outset, they could get sucked into this just by being exposed to it on social media, or just by having friends at school who come out as, claiming to be transgender. We have seen these clusters of girls, especially, where one girl in a school will announce a transgender identity, and suddenly there's 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 girls who are her friends who are also coming out and saying they're transgender. Lisa Lippman has talked about this in her research, and a number of other people are bringing it up, noting that this is clear evidence of a social contagion going on.
Well, and we've seen this before with other things. Social contagions, especially in this age group, are just so prevalent. This is this is nothing like gender ideology. But when I was a kid, when I was a teenager, it was stirrup pants. Everybody was wearing stirrup pants, and every girl had a pair of.
I actually was just about to bring that up, believe it or not, because it was such a big deal to have them, and I didn't have any, and I felt like such an outcast because everybody else had them.
Yeah, I remember this one party that I went to, and all my friends were going to be there, and I wore my stirrup pants, and like every girl there had black stirrup pants on, except for one of my good friends, who she was like the fashion queen of the group, and she wore these floral print jeans.
Oh.
And she said, I knew everybody else was going to wear their stirrup pants, so I decided to wear these. Well, what do you think I went out and bought that week? I went out and bought some floral jeans.
Yep. And I think about my children too, the things that they feel like they have to have in order to fit in with the other kids. Some of the things are just beyond silly. I remember Gigapets where my daughter was gonna, like, oh, it was just this horrible thing if she didn't have one. She just, all of her friends had one, and she just had to have one. Otherwise she wasn't going to fit in. And what would she do when all the other kids were playing with their Gigapet? And it was, she created this drama around it that was just crazy, but that's part of this age group, is that everything feels so big. And if you don't fit in, oh my gosh, that feels so powerful. And I shouldn't have probably used the word crazy, because even though it seems kind of crazy to the adults, the kids, it feels so big and so powerful, and they so desperately want to fit in.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times adults forget that when you are at that age, when you're 13, 14, 15, and your world is just starting to open up and you're moving out of the home, out from under your parents, and you're really interacting with the world more, you're having experiences that you haven't had before. And I think about how kids, they're so in love the first time they get a boyfriend or a girlfriend. And to that child, and I even hate to use the word child because they're teenagers, that relationship is so important. It is so critical. And they really think, I have found my soulmate. This is who I'm going to be with for the rest of my life. And as adults, we look at that and we go, most high school relationships don't last.
Or
Adults
we'll
know.
even call it puppy love, which is, if you're a teenager, it's just like, oh, you don't know mine is real. I mean, it just,
It's so insulting. It's so insulting. And it
yeah,
really is kind of
it
insulting.
really is.
It's so important and so powerful. And they have never experienced that before.
Mm.
And if it does end, that is a catastrophe to them because they don't have any of the coping skills that adults have developed. They've never had their heart broken before.
Yeah.
And so they don't have those coping skills. And so we as adults, we really do need to have a little bit more empathy and understanding for
Mhm.
what these kids are going through, I think.
Yeah. And the other thing that I want to point out, especially for these girls, and this is where we really are seeing this as a social contagion, is that it's hitting girls right when their bodies are starting to change. And all of a sudden, they're having to cope with potentially grown men ogling them in a way that is very uncomfortable. All of a sudden, their clothes aren't fitting quite right. They might have to go out and buy a bra. I mean, all of these things are just, some girls really celebrate this and feel like they're growing into their own. But for a lot of us, it's just this very uncomfortable time. Maybe our periods are starting and we're really anxious about that. And that's a lot, if suddenly someone were to come in and say, you know what, you don't have to deal with any of that. I have a solution for you. It's not surprising so many of these girls are jumping at the opportunity to just stave off all that discomfort.
Yeah. I remember when I was 13 and I was just starting to develop a chest. And I was one of those girls who I wanted to be grown up. I wanted to develop my womanly figure. But I laid down on my bed on my stomach to read, which is how I always laid. And suddenly I was like, oh, that's not comfortable. Like there was something there that wasn't there before. And even though I wanted to grow up and I wanted to be a mature woman, my breasts were in the way. And I remember being so irritated. Like, do you mean I can't lay on my stomach anymore? Um, and I think what these kids are going through now, and I mean, our culture today is so much more sexed than it was when I was a teenager. The amount of sexualization. I mean, I was doing some research on pop music a few years ago, and 92% of Billboard top 10 music has sexual messages in it. 92%. And if you listen to it, it's all about sex. And I just spoke to a mom this morning on the phone who her daughter just announced this about 6 months ago, and the mom's trying to figure out how to cope with it. Anyway, and this mom said that her daughter, who is who's 13, just is not interested in sex at all. She wants nothing to do with it. And there was apparently some locker room talk that one of the girls in the locker room was talking about her boyfriend playing with her breasts and how much she liked it at 13, 14 years old. And this girl was just traumatized by hearing that. And she said, I don't want anybody messing with my breasts. I don't ever want to have children. I don't want any part of this. And I thought the mom was so wise. Her instinct was good. She just told her daughter, I think what you're feeling is normal.
Yeah.
I think that's actually totally okay to feel that way.
Yeah. And I also want to address boys too, because There are some boys who identify as a girl as a result of some kind of a fetish, but we're finding out that a lot of the boys who are taking on this trans identity when they're younger, a lot of it is due to things we've already talked about, sexual trauma. I have a dear friend who was molested when he was in 5th grade, and as a result of that, he just wanted his penis gone. And then we have boys who have autism, we have boys who are depressed. But the other thing that I'm hearing more and more often is that boys who are sensitive are picking up on sort of the negative feelings that some women have about men. The Me Too movement was very powerful and sent a message sort of that a lot of men are toxic. There's this toxic masculinity. And if you have a young man who's sensitive, he sometimes might be feeling like, I don't want to be associated with that. I interviewed Hashi, and he's an older man who identified as a woman for a number of years, and he said a lot of it had to do with the fact that his stepfather was a violent and mean male role model, and he didn't want to associate himself with that. A lot of times we do talk about girls in this program because it is hitting girls more than it is boys. But I think it's really important to also be sensitive to the fact that there are boys and young men who are struggling with this, and that it is because, perhaps they're very sensitive and they don't want to be associated as male. Perhaps they've had trauma, depression, or perhaps, there are other things going on. They want to be popular, and not to just automatically assume that they have some kind of a fetish and write them off, because I think they deserve our compassion and support too.
Yeah, I think so too. Historically, trans identified men, it tended to be almost entirely adult men. And this is a new thing that we're seeing kids in it. And I think you're right that I think a lot of times we hear about a boy, a teenage boy who's trans identifying, and we automatically think autogynephile, porn saturation. And I don't think that's fair. And I don't think it's right. And I think you're right about the whole toxic masculinity portion of it. But also, you mentioned wanting to be popular. And I think something that we really need to pay attention to with this, the activism around this has been so powerful. And anyone who's watching, if you have in any place, in a friend group, online, or whatever, questioned anything about this ideology, you've probably felt the venom from the other side. No one is allowed to question this. No one is allowed to raise concerns. Well, if you think about a kid who's in middle school or high school, a lot of these kids who are identifying are a little bit on the fringe. They don't quite fit in. They're not the popular big man on campus kind of kids. When they announce a transgender identity, they're untouchable. Nobody can criticize them. Nobody can question them. Nobody can put them down. There is no more bullying coming their way, because
The teachers are guarding them and the other students are guarding them. Suddenly they're untouchable, really.
and they can get teachers fired because we've seen it happen. We've seen it happen with Peter Vlaming in West Point, Virginia. A trans identified student heard him use the pronoun she didn't like and got him fired. And so think about the heady amount of power that comes with that. Frankly, who wouldn't want that kind of power when they're 13, 14, 15 years old?
Yeah, and that's the other thing that I think is important, that this age group is constantly trying on new identities, and we know this. This is actually part of the developmental process that kids go through during puberty. That's so important, is trying on different looks, different styles, different personalities, and so it's not surprising that we have kids trying this on. Unfortunately, when kids try this on, there's like such hoopla all of a sudden surrounding this that it's really hard for them to back out. In most cases, a kid might try on, maybe I'll be goth for a while. People aren't celebrating that. They don't have, this whole affirmative care for goth people, or I don't know, preppies. For a while, being a preppy girl was really popular. Well, these days, if a girl decides to be preppy, people aren't going to be celebrating that. And so this is sort of one of the only cases I can think of where that identity is almost cemented on the child as soon as they identify as it. Instead of people saying, well, okay, you're trying that out for a while. It's like, no, oh, you are trans. You were born that way. That's who you are. That's your authentic self. And we're going to do everything we can to protect that identity now so that you don't move through it to something else.
Yeah, you don't see posters in the hallway about the preppy club or, all kids who like to wear orange.
Yeah, you don't even really have it for,
There's nothing like that. It's
yeah,
only this.
yeah, even for, I mean, I'm
Yeah,
thinking
it's
we've tried to, at some point there have been some efforts to get more girls involved in STEM fields, and there were some posters and there were some organizations, but nothing like what we're seeing today. The celebratoriness, the money, and this pathway. So in most cases, when a child takes on an identity, they kind of feel it, feel their way around themselves. In this case, they take on this identity, and suddenly there is a pathway for them. And at every point, there's a celebration, there's an encouragement, there are people there telling them how wonderful and authentic they are, and how none of their problems are their fault anymore. In fact, it's other people's fault. And boy, if you're a teenager who doesn't, it's hard to take on responsibility. All of a sudden, you don't have to worry about any of that. So to me, it's almost surprising more kids haven't bought into this cult.
Yeah, and I appreciate that you ended with the word cult there, because that's really what it is. There is an identity that's being put on these kids, that's being celebrated, that's being fostered. And one of the things that you hear the trans rights people say is, oh, gender's on a continuum. So you can be all the way over here and be super feminine, or all the way over here and be super masculine. It's all based on stereotypes. If you ask, can you give me a definition of gender that doesn't rely on stereotypes? There isn't one. But you've commented on this before, Erin. If I'm a girl, I can flow toward masculine as much as I want and be celebrated. But if I start flowing back toward being feminine,
Yep.
oh, no, that's not acceptable.
Yeah, that is not okay. And I'm glad that you used the word foster, because it reminded me of another group that is often overlooked, that is really vulnerable to this, and that's foster children. Foster children have an incredibly high rate of this. And one of the things that's incredibly concerning to me now is in California, they're actually really almost like grooming foster parents to accept and affirm their foster kids coming in. And again, if you're looking at kids who have had a troubled past and are looking for a new identity, it's no wonder that this population is vulnerable. I believe that there's some other populations that are vulnerable, such as those who have some developmental delays. They tend to be more vulnerable. And again, it's because they don't tend to be the popular kids. They're the vulnerable kids. And you've even mentioned of people reporting that GSA clubs and other trans activists they specifically target kids who look like they're vulnerable, very much the way pedophiles do when they try to target a child to groom so that they can prey upon them.
Yeah, I spoke to a mom in the DC area who went to a theater, and it was theater groups, both school and like community theater groups. And it was supposed to be an equity, diversity, inclusion training. But she said the entire thing was about trans and about sexual orientation and gender identity, how to get it into the theater, how to write your own stuff, share your stuff, so that we have lots and lots and lots of this. That's what it was all about. But she was horrified because she said in that meeting, which was a training, the trainer said, stand in the hallways at school, look who's alone at their lockers, go to the lunchroom, see who's sitting by themselves, go talk to them about sex and gender identity. That's grooming behavior. That's predatory grooming
That's
behavior.
predatory behavior, yeah. So we have a couple of clips to watch that sort of explore these other underlying conditions that can prime a kid to be vulnerable to this.
Certain groups of children are being diagnosed with or claiming transgender identities in very disproportionate numbers. These include children residing in foster homes, children who were adopted at the rate of about 3 times greater incidence of transgenderism, children with a prior history of psychiatric illness, children with mental developmental disturbances.
A lot of them will say they've spent a lot of time on social media where they've seen a lot of people who've transitioned, feeling it was very cool, feeling that it was a way to get away from being female. Quite a lot of them seem to have had a very negative experience of being female in a female body.
If we're just reverting to normal now that there's greater societal acceptance, right? We're just reverting to a normal base rate of transgender women. Why are all the women in their 40s and 60s coming out as trans? They should be coming out. Now's their time. Now's their moment. We should see tons of women in their 40s and 60s and so on coming out as transgender. But we're not seeing that. We're seeing the same population that gets involved in cutting, demonic possession, witchcraft, anorexia, bulimia, and convinces themselves there's a problem. And there's one last reason, is that suicide rates are going up. But if these women who were living under a prior, supposedly these real transgender people who were living under a more repressive regime and are now just finding themselves, you would think the suicide rate would be going down with greater acceptance.
So one of the things that I thought Abigail Schreier pointed out, which is really important, is that I hear activists saying that the reason we have so many more kids identifying as transgender is because they've been in the shadows all this time. And I think that Abigail pushed back on that in a way that makes so much sense, and that I've actually noticed too, that if that were true, the suicide rates would have been so much higher before we started affirming kids in this. And in fact, the opposite is true. The more we've become affirming of this, the higher the suicide rates, completed suicide rates, are for children and teenagers, which is horrifying. It means we're doing something terribly wrong. And it doesn't mean that it's because these kids are feeling more like their authentic self. It's because, there's something seriously gone awry in our culture to have. And it's not just slight increases. We're having, serious increases in completed suicide rates. So that to me is a clear indication that something is terribly wrong, that this affirmative approach is not working, and that these kids weren't always transgender and they just finally feel comfortable coming out.
Yeah, well, and I think she pointed out too that we're seeing the increasing suicide rates right along with this ideology being promoted. Yeah. So we've said before, we can't say there's causation there, but when you see that kind of correlation and it's really in the same time frame, you have to wonder what's going on. But I also appreciated what she said about, okay, if this is just society getting more accepting and that's why we're seeing this, where are the women in their 40s and 60s coming out with this?
Yeah.
You can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know of very many stories of middle-aged or older women doing this. I know some of men doing it, but not some.
I've heard stories, and this is actually typical of autogynephiles, that they've had their kids, they're married, they have their kids, and then they come out as transgender. And this is very typical of an autogynephile. There are very few cases of women my age who are coming out and saying, "Oh, it turns out I was born in the wrong body." And that actually is surprising to me, because it's hard to be an older woman. And in some ways, I would think that we would be the perfect demographic, because older women tend not to be valued very much in our society. And yet we don't see that happening. And so and also, again, we don't see in countries that have historically been much more open and affirming than ours, we haven't seen this incredible rate until recently when it started to be affirmed. So I think that there's some very good research that shows that affirming this, it's not that there's always been so many transgender people and they've just been hiding in the shadows. That just doesn't make sense. And it really does make sense when you look at the social contagion aspect of it and all these other factors that we've been talking about.
Yeah, I just think, just to summarize kind of all of this for parents, if you're dealing with this announcement from your child, really spend some time examining your child. Try to figure out what has gone on with your child socially, medically, psychologically. I would even get a piece of paper and just start writing down everything you know about your child. Because if you can sort of figure out, oh, this is the need that transgender ideology is fulfilling. There's some reason that kids are getting sucked into this. And if you can sort of pinpoint, I think I know what this child was lacking, whether it was social status or whether it was fear of growing up or whether it was autism, then you have a little bit better idea how to start addressing it.
Yeah, that's a really good idea.
Well, we have a couple questions from listeners. The first one, almost every girl in my daughter's friend group is now identifying as transgender, yet the school counselor and the principal insist this is not a social contagion. What is going on?
Yeah, what's going on is people are being gaslighted, that this ideology has really taken hold, and that administrators are either unwilling to see what's happening or afraid to accept what's happening. We know that people are losing their jobs if they say anything at all against this ideology. And so I think that there's a lot of factors that are going on, but this is it's so clearly social contagion. And when you talk to these parents, so many of these kids are rewriting their history to fit the script. These are kids who never experienced gender dysphoria. They had no indication of being uncomfortable with being the sex that they are. And then all of a sudden, as their friends are coming out as transgender, suddenly they're rewriting their history to fit this narrative, which is classic of a social contagion.
And we did an episode where we looked at social psychology
Yeah.
and how hard it is for somebody to stand up when everybody around you is saying, no, the sky is orange, to stand up and go, no, the sky is blue. It's very hard to do that. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of educators are I don't know if guilty is the right word, but susceptible to that as well.
Yeah. And I would encourage a parent, if they're in this situation, to maybe look into finding another school, because once a kid's kind of been indoctrinated in this, and if the school is completely oblivious to what's going on, that child is going to be more at risk of sort of really being sucked in.
Mm-hmm. Well, and unfortunately, I think schools are often less oblivious than they are complicit.
Culpable. Yeah.
Culpable. That the schools are really pushing this.
Yeah.
And this just infuriates me. But I spoke to a mom who said she was having her daughter evaluated by a psychiatrist or neurological psychologist, someone. The daughter was not seeing this professional. They were just trying to get a diagnosis if she was autistic or not. So the psychiatrist or psychologist was doing the battery of tests. And the mom really weighed whether she should say anything to the psychiatrist about her daughter being non-binary, because the daughter wasn't really talking about it yet. Well, the mom said, I felt like I should give her all the information. So I told the psychiatrist, look, my daughter has said this. We don't believe this is what's going on. We think something else. I'm just telling you this so that you're aware.
Mm-hmm.
Please just, take this into consideration, but don't talk about it at all. Well, as the psychologist was giving the results of her test, she turned to the child and said, now, when I fill out your report for your school, is there a different name that you want me to use? Are there different pronouns that you want me to use? And the mom said, this just invigorated the daughter to start going public with it.
I bet. Oh my gosh, to have that kind of an adult authority figure validate. Yeah, that's so sad. And again, we're seeing this over and over and over again, which is why parents need to be so careful about the specialists they take their kids to.
I almost feel like there's not really anyone neutral right now.
Yeah.
And that might be a little bit extreme, but I'm not sure that's really extreme. I think people are either for this or they are aware of how damaging it is and they are against it.
Yeah.
And I don't think you can trust that there are any neutral parties around your child.
Yeah.
Well, the other question we have is, my son is adamant that he's transgender, but I can see so many other psychological and social struggles that he's not addressing. How can his dad and I try to shift the focus off gender and back onto things that really need to be looked at?
That's a good question. And as we talked about in the other episodes, a lot of times these kids are struggling with other things. And I think, I would just suggest to the parents, one of the ways to do this is to re-engage with the child, to really honor those things that are troubling them, and to help sort through that. So if the child is depressed, try to get them out of that depression, because again, that makes them more vulnerable. And maybe even say to them, look, we understand that you're having these feelings, but we want to address these other issues first, and then let's talk about it. That gives the parent and the child some time to sort of, you know, cool off, because we know that this can get very volatile, and it allows sort of the parents to have an in with the kid to help them work through those other issues.
Yeah, I agree with you. I want to echo that. As much as you can kind of shift the focus off of this, anybody who's worked with a teenager knows telling them you cannot do this is like inviting them, try to push back on mom and dad. So as much as you can try not to be authoritarian about it, but just say, wow, that's important. But I think maybe the bigger deal right now is this other thing. So can we focus on this other thing first, get this under control or get this managed, and then go back to talk about this? Because I think you're right. I think once the child, first of all, gets distracted from this thing, that it will suck in everything in their life. That's what a cult does. Everything gets viewed through the lens of the cult. So if you can just get that child to kind of step out of that, to look at this other stuff over here, that might do a lot to weaken their fascination with the cult's ideology.
Yeah, because kids really, they do tend to get focused on one thing. Again, if the kid is on the spectrum, that's part of the being on the spectrum, is that, hyper focusing on it. And so, finding ways to draw them out of that is going to be really important. And also, we have some other episodes that sort of talk about how to address, autism, depression, trauma, if those are issues.
Yeah, well, this has been a fascinating subject today. I hope we hit all the points that parents wanted to hit. If you have any questions, anything you'd like us to address, we're making new episodes every week. We're just trying to talk about different facets of this and sort of give parents maybe a little different lens to view it through than they have in the past.
And what are we doing next week?
Next week, we are going to talk about Planned Parenthood in the gender industry.
And this is going to probably be very uncomfortable for some people. There are a lot of people who have 100% supported Planned Parenthood most of their life. And I think it'll be really disturbing to them to find out how Planned Parenthood is now, I believe, the #1 provider of cross-sex hormones.
Mm-hmm. I used to be a supporter of Planned Parenthood. I used to think very well of them. And I've had my eyes open just in the last year to some things that are really troubling. So I hope you'll come back and listen to that and consider what we have to say about it.
And don't forget, we do have the resources listed in the description below, so that you can go and access the videos that the video clips that we've used, or some other additional resources that we have for you. So thank you.
Yep, and if you need any support, if you need any help, please come to partnersforethicalcare.com. We have a chat line open. We try very hard to get back to people in a brief time. We try to do it within 24 hours. There's often people manning the chat lines. You might be able to get somebody, to help you right now, but there's lots of resources on that website. So please come and seek those out.
Well, thank you, Maria.
Thank you, Erin. See you next time.
Hey.
We are not doctors or therapists. We are not giving medical or psychiatric advice, and we offer no guarantee of outcomes. We simply want to talk about how to support and love kids using long understood best practices from the fields of psychology, education, and child development. We're glad you joined in our conversation today, and we hope that you took away something you can put in your toolkit for parenting your gender-confused kids with truth and love.